Evening Session Introduction. Programming Overview, January 15th. Ministry, Connected Jesus Series. Happy Forever. 1. Segment 1. The Bible Today, Genesis chapter 15. Topic: The Covenant and the Shield of Faith. G. God's plan. God initiated a covenant with Abram, promising a vast heritage despite physical impossibilities. He presents himself as Abram's shield and great reward. P. Purpose and preparation. of purpose is to move Abram from fear to faith. God prepares him by showing the stars, teaching us that our heritage is a celestial promise, not just a biological one. S. Strategic action. Trust the process. When God makes a promise, our strategic action is credited as righteousness through faith. We must stop looking at our limitations and start looking at the star maker.
Genesis 16. Running ahead of God. Have we ever run ahead of God? We have, and the results are usually not the best. But what does it mean to run ahead of God? This is what we found from Google Artificial Intelligence. Running ahead of God, in a spiritual context, refers to acting or making decisions before one has received clear direction or guidance from God, often driven by impatience or a desire to control outcomes. It can lead to misalignment with God's plan and potentially cause difficulties and heartache. What does running ahead of God entail? Impatient eagerness. Running ahead of God is often fueled by a desire to see things happen quickly without waiting for God's timing. Misaligned with God's will. When we act without God's guidance, we risk making choices that are not aligned with His overall plan for our lives. Disaster and heartache. The scriptures often highlight the negative consequences of running ahead of God, including misunderstandings, disagreements, and even losing blessings. God's timing. God has a perfect timetable for our lives, and rushing ahead often disrupts that timetable. Divine timing versus human timing. God's timing is often different from our own, and it's important to recognize and trust in His perfect timing. Waiting on God. A key element of following God's lead is learning to wait patiently, trusting that He will reveal His will in His own time. In Genesis 15, verses 3 and 4, God promised Abram that he would have a child from his own body that would be his heir. Abram believed in the Lord, and He accounted it to him for righteousness. Genesis 15, verse 6. However, 10 years had passed, and there was no sign of a child. See Genesis 16, verse 3. The promise had been made when Abram was 76 years old. Now, 10 years later, it would seem that the promise would not be fulfilled because of Abram and Sarai's age. What do we do when God's promises seem to be unfulfilled or delayed according to our timetable? Do we take matters into our own hands? Do we run ahead of God to fulfill His promises? Well, Sarai, Abram's wife, decided to fulfill God's promises her way. So, Sarai said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. Genesis 16, verses 2 and 3. This is the second time the Bible registers a recommendation given by a wife to her husband that should not have been headed. The first time was when Eve suggested to Adam to eat the forbidden fruit. See Genesis 3, verse 6. And now Sarai suggests to Abram to have a surrogate wife, a woman who acts as a gestational carrier in a surrogacy agreement, meaning she carries a baby for another couple who is unable to conceive or carry a pregnancy to term. This can be viewed as a form of traditional surrogacy, where the surrogate contributes her own egg and carries the pregnancy. This practice was accepted in their culture, where childlessness could be a source of shame. Generated by Google Artificial Intelligence. Men need to step up to the plate. They need to have a mind of their own, and they also need to obey God rather than obey their spouses. See Acts 5, verse 29. There are times that spouses are right in their reasoning, but we should always put God's requirements first in our lives. Abram believed in the Lord, and He accounted it to him for righteousness. Genesis 15, verse 6. Then, why doubt God just because 10 years had passed? God's timetable is never the same as ours. Do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. 2 Peter 3, verse 8. We have fallen prey to impatience on many occasions. This is the reason why we ended up in such high debt. We need to be patient and let God fulfill His timetable in our lives. In addition, our impatience has had repercussions on other people's lives. In the case of Abram and Sarai, Hagar, who had nothing to do in the matter, was thrown into forming a triangle relationship. Even though there are other factors involved, the Middle East conflict between Palestinians and Israelites have their origin in part from the ancient conflict between the descendants of Ishmael, Hagar's son, and the descendants of Isaac, Sarah's son. Have we ever run ahead of God to fulfill His promises in our lives? What happens when we use human methods or those that are prevalent in our time to fulfill God's promises? We realize from our own experience that this does not work. We wanted to have an abundance of material goods using the prevailing methods of our time. We used credit cards as part of the social status of the time, but this only brought us financial problems. One of the virtues that we need to develop in this generation is patience. Patience is widely considered a virtue, a socially desirable character trait. It involves the ability to wait calmly, endure delays, or accept difficulties without becoming agitated or reactive. Many cultures and philosophies value patience because it demonstrates self-control, maturity, and the ability to maintain perspective even in challenging situations, generated by Google Artificial Intelligence.